Okay, so this is the next lecture that will take us from the Exodus experience to Israel's life in the Promised Land as a nation under the covenant that the Lord established with them at Mount Sinai. So we have the real beginning of the history of this nation of Israel in the land that was promised to it. So we've got a lot to cover today. Let's begin with a brief prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O Heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of truth, everywhere present and filling all things, treasury of blessings and giver of life, come dwell within us, cleanse us of all stain, and save our souls, O good one. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay, so the overarching theme for this chapter in history of Israel is the covenantal relationship with God, because this is what links their experience in Egypt and in the wilderness on their way out of Egypt to their experience entering the promised land and living in this new land of Canaan that was given to them. And so it's really this relationship, this binding, all-encompassing relationship, like a marriage between God and Israel that unites their experience in these various places. The question that Father Bartholomew begins with in his chapter 3, A God Who Chooses, is why Israel? Why did God choose Israel of all the different peoples or nations that he could have chosen? He himself says this looks like a very dangerous question, but it's an important question to engage because of the answer that the Bible itself gives to it. First, we should look at the original conditions of this election, though. So it's not as if we are asking now, why did God choose the nation of Israel or the Jewish people as we know them today? It's why did God choose these people at the original time of their choosing in the Bible? People like Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, Moses. When you ask why God chooses Israel, you're asking why God chooses these people in their own time and place, in their own context. And you can look at these different people that God obviously selects to be his instruments of what he's doing. And one thing seems to unite them. One common trait seems to run through all of these figures. And it's namely that there's really no human custom or explanation that comes to the surface. It's not as if God chooses Abraham for some obvious reason. He's the most powerful person in the world. He's the most influential, or even the most spiritually enlightened. Jacob is the younger son. Joseph is the youngest son, at least at the time. Moses seems to come out of nowhere and is just a baby who is hidden and then spared from a genocide. God chooses these people that don't obviously have a right or prerogative based on human custom. God chooses this people in a state in which they don't really fully know who's engaging them, who's addressing them. Father Bartholomew rightly points out that when God speaks to Abraham, Abraham has really no basis for knowing who this speaker is. The speaker is unknown. That's an important point because it highlights the fact that Israel comes to know God only after it's chosen. It's the election and the choosing that comes first, and then the growing relationship brings intimacy and knowledge after that. So it's almost like an arranged marriage. It has this asymmetrical element to it. It's as if these two partners in this binding, all-encompassing permanent agreement are entering into the agreement and then discovering who the other is. And if you take that perspective, particularly from Israel's point of view, it helps to make sense of a lot of the stories and the struggles that Israel goes through. They're trying to figure out who this God is who has chosen them, because his identity, his character, and his name only comes into focus gradually So the other point that Father Bartolome brings up is that God chooses a group. God could have revealed himself in other ways. Father Bartolome floats two possible alternatives. God could have chosen he could have chosen all of mankind. He could have progressively brought to maturity by interior guidance the whole of mankind at once. So you could think of this sort of mass enlightenment or mass growth toward God. There's no reason why God could not have dealt with the whole of humanity simultaneously and brought them into a covenant of all humanity. He could have also dealt with some selected individual, some extraordinary genius or religiously enlightened, extraordinary person, and then built from there, from that one person. And you might even argue that that's kind of how he begins with Abraham, although there's really nothing extraordinary about Abraham that at least is included in the scriptures. But when God makes his definitive covenant and gives his law and a place for him to dwell, to come and meet mankind at the tabernacle, he chooses a group. So God's method for restoring humanity is neither universalist, dealing with everybody, nor individualist, focusing on some individual. God is choosing a community. It's a communitarian approach. He's choosing a group of people. And the way Father Bartolome puts it is, God chose out of a particular human group that was only a small part of mankind in general. He selected out of all of mankind, not an individual, but a group of individuals. And this group of individuals was not especially brilliant or accomplished. It was rather God's choice of them that made them who they are. And it's important to highlight what we don't know, what God doesn't say about this choice. It's not based on any sort of metric that we could point out. It's not because the Israelites were more numerous, more advanced, more culturally developed. God's choice seems to come from nowhere and then works with this people, and they become a people because of the choice that God makes. All right, now Father Bartolome starts to deal with some common themes that run throughout the early part of the scriptures, Genesis and Exodus. The first major theme he talks about is listening. This is a mark of Abraham most of all. This is the primary figure in this section of the chapter. Abraham is called to go to a new land, and so he must become a wanderer again. Now, the story of Babel seems to suggest that there was a tendency to form cities, stable points of population, concentrations of human beings living in the same place. And this is not really portrayed as something positive in the Bible. This, in fact, is a kind of crystallization of the sin of Adam and Eve. It's a making permanent of the state of alienation. We want to build the world for ourselves. Abraham is taken out of that type of setting. He's dislocated from the cities in order to become a wanderer again, which was the state where God left Adam. And of course, it was intensified with Cain. But God's solution to wandering away from him is to keep wandering. It's when humanity stops wandering and says, you know what, we're just going to settle down and just try to make the world the best that we can make it. We're going to build these permanent establishments and create our own order. This is when the alienation from God becomes more permanent, becomes more serious. It's almost like humanity needs to become more liquefied, needs to become more docile and receptive to God. And so he sends Abraham from his location where he's probably very familiar with things, lots of routine, to a place that's unfamiliar. And so he's more pliant in God's hands. So Abraham hears this unknown voice telling him to go to an unknown land. And it's remarkably indeterminate and abrupt. And it's quite amazing that Abraham would have listened. Whatever Abraham must have heard, Father Barthelemy says, it must have been a supremely authoritative voice for him to obey it without knowing its source and without really knowing where this authority was leading him. And Abraham has to live or learn to live with a lot of loose ends. Abraham struggles with not only who God is, but how God brings about what he says he's going to bring about, how he works in the world. But he comes to accept that God has his ways, that he may not be fully privy to them, he may not fully understand them. And what God is doing here is basically asking Abraham to give up his hold on the future and how this future is going to come about. Because the perennial human tendency is when you see the means ends relationships for how your future is going to go, we step in and take hold of it. Okay, I understand the game. Now let me control the game and how things are going to play out. But at every turn, the Lord takes that away from Abraham and says, you're just going to need to keep in a state of receptive trust. You're going to have to rely upon me. Father Barthelemy says, we realize the gratuitousness of a gift only when it is taken away from us. And this is primarily in reference to Isaac, of course. So the vehicle of vehicles, like the principal means for the fulfillment of God's promises and the playing out of Abraham's future is Isaac. And God asks for Isaac back. Why? What's going on there? Well, Father Barthelemy's analysis is basically that in relinquishing ownership, even over this most important of gifts, Abraham is learning how to receive or how to possess Isaac as a gift. We possess God's gifts, Father Barthelemy says, knowing them truly to be the gifts of God, only when, like Abraham, we receive them a second time from his hands, having been ready to surrender them to him without seeing why. So it's about fixating ourselves on God's plan, not ours, or not our version of what we think God's plan should be. God is teaching Abraham that everything comes to him, everything comes from him, everything is a gift. And so Abraham is trained to relinquish control over everything in his life. And he's developing, again, this relationship of dependence and trust that was characteristic of that original relationship between Adam and Eve and God. Okay, the next major theme that Father Barthelemy focuses on is God's primacy in choosing. So it's God who makes the choice, not us. And in doing that, God's disrupting established patterns like the older son gets the inheritance and rules over the younger son, or all these other patterns like, the richest or the most powerful should be the representative of humanity that's chosen. God disrupts these established patterns, chooses who he will choose in order to show that it's not human precedent and tradition that's at work here. It's he himself who's at work here. So in Jacob's case, he's the younger son. He shouldn't receive the inheritance, but he does. For Joseph, this is even more extreme. He's discarded. He's sold into slavery, and yet he becomes that which holds the family all together, this keystone that binds the family together, the one that was basically thrown out of the family and seen as disposable to the family. And we see here the mystery of God's grace, that God chooses on the basis of love alone, and that there seems to be a certain preference for those who are less, those who are more in need, those who are subjugated. God focuses on them, not on the most powerful, the most privileged. And Father Barthelemy quotes this verse from Deuteronomy, which I think is central to this question of why did God choose Israel? It was not because you were more in number than any other people that Yahweh set his love upon you and chose you. For you are the fewest of all peoples, but it is because Yahweh loves you and is keeping the oath which he swore to your fathers that Yahweh has brought you out. So this is Moses speaking to the people who are going into the promised land, explaining to them that it's not anything you've done that has earned you this choice, that has earned you these rewards that you are going to receive. It's God's love alone. That explains why he chose you. So we don't earn God's love. God's love alone makes us capable of receiving that love, makes us lovable. And what the Lord often is doing in these early stories in the Bible is breaking people down in order to build them back up again, kind of like, Marine boot camp. God removes all possible sources of hope, all human means of fulfillment, and forces the people of Israel to rely upon him alone. The Lord arranges things so that he becomes the people's only hope. And in doing this, his transformation of the people is often deep. It's not superficial. Father Bartholomew compares God in these early parts of the Bible more to a surgeon than a therapist. He wants to dig deep and transform his people from their very depths in order to be able to make them worthy of the gifts that he wants to give them. God will dig deep into him so that there may be born in him the man whom God eventually intends to shower with gifts. So God's remaking his creatures in these stories so as to make them capable of receiving these great gifts, often gifts that we can't even imagine. But the greatest of these gifts is the promise that is the basis for hope. And this promise is something whose fulfillment lies in the future. But it's the greatest gift because it gives man an orientation. It gives the human person a reason to go on, and it gives us hope for some ultimate fulfillment. All right, he then transitions into the Exodus. He talks about the historical background of Israel's subjugation in Egypt and how the people descends to the point of extermination. Talks about these shepherd kings from the Palestine, from the Levant region, called the Hyksos. We don't know much about them at all, but there's evidence that they seized control over Lower Egypt, so where the Nile Delta is, around the same time in the general neighborhood of the Exodus story. Other poor Palestinian clans or nomads followed these shepherd kings into the Nile Delta when they took over this part of Egypt in order to have a more stable source of food. And with this stable food source, these poor Semites proliferate. And so you have a demographic change from the way Egypt used to be when the dynastic pharaoh was overthrown and sent to the Upper Nile. It's called Upper Egypt. But this regime eventually comes back and reclaims power and drives the Hyksos out, drives these shepherd kings out. But the poor Semitic clans that came with the Hyksos can't return to Palestine, and so they're left there. They become a kind of dangerous fifth column left behind by the invaders of yesterday, is how Father Bartholomew puts it. So they become a vulnerable minority. They come to be seen as a threat, a remnant from this past invasion, this coup. And it's understandable how they would be then the target of oppression and eventually genocide. So first, they're exploited before they become targets of extermination. He says this double policy of exploitation and extermination is exactly like Hitler's plan in the Third Reich with regard to the Jews. First, there's forced labor for the national defense, which eventually leads to genocide. They come to be seen as disposable once they can't do any more work for the regime in power. Father Bartholomew calls this history's first systematic genocide, which is interesting. I don't know if that's true or not, but he says there's three ingredients that have to be there for a genocide like this. First, you have to have some sort of empire, usually with an absolute ruler who claims power over every aspect of life. You need to have a complex bureaucracy that can help to control the population, and then some vulnerable minority, a scapegoat, an other that is to be targeted, exploited, and eventually discarded. So in this way, Egypt dehumanizes the Israelites until, as Father Bartholomew says, they forgot the very meaning of freedom. And this is a very insightful point, I think. There's one thing to be exploited It's another thing to see oneself as inevitably exploited, as worthy of exploitation. True slavery is being incapable of imagining yourself as anything but a slave. It's when you accept that identity that's imposed upon you from an oppressive power that you truly become enslaved. And this is what happens to Israel in Father Bartholomew's view. They lose the taste for freedom, he says. They're no longer even capable of hoping or praying for liberation. He writes, Egypt had succeeded in killing in them not only liberty itself, but the very taste for liberty and faith in justice. They did not know how to appeal, to supplicate, to pray. They had no idea of how to wrest their liberty from God. They only knew how to cry out, and this was the cry God heard. It's a very interesting little gloss on this phrase from Exodus 3. So the Lord heard their cry, not their prayer, supplication, not their ritual sacrifice. They were way beyond that. They were like infants whose cry was much more immediate and unreflective. They were in such a state of oppression that they couldn't even put into words. They didn't even know whom to address a prayer. So it's a picture of despair. It's a picture of a people who in many ways prefer the misery that they know to the happiness that they no longer believe is possible and that they can't even imagine, or that they can't even bother to imagine. And within this state, there is, as is typical, internal division and a kind of hierarchy of slaves. And this helps explain why some of them resisted Moses' efforts to free them. Why did some of them want to return to slavery? Well, there they at least had some kind of privileged place on a hierarchy, but that hierarchy would divide one slave against another. There was some trifling advantage to preserve. And Father Bartholomew compares this to the kapos in the Holocaust, these Jewish collaborators in the concentration camps who would serve as kind of overseers or supervisors in the camps in return for lenient treatment or small extra privileges. It was also prevalent among the slaves here in the United States. You would have people who would collaborate with the oppressor in order to receive some sort of advantage relative to the other enslaved peoples. And these people would rather keep everyone else enslaved for some meager reward than to fight for the freedom of all. They'd rather help the oppressor for an extra crust of bread. And of course, that's what happened in the camps, in the Holocaust. The people as a whole in this sort of situation in which they're just trying to get the least little scrap of comfort that they can. They don't really have the luxury of thinking about their humanity, their dignity, what they would ideally like to live like. They forget the very meaning of freedom. And Father Bartholomew says, one cannot speak of real misery until it has reached the stage where man forgets the possibility of redemption. So it's the lowest point, you might say, of human misery, at least corporate human misery, that one can imagine. It's from this place that God takes his people, chooses them, brings them out, liberates them, and then enters into this marriage covenant with them. And Moses is uniquely situated to lead them, to be their liberator. He was raised in freedom, yet still bound to those who were enslaved. Moses was brought up as a free man, while the rest of his people were slaves. So that means that he had a foot in both worlds. Father Bartholomew writes, God began by preserving him in his infancy so that he should know what freedom means. Without this, he would never have understood the people's servitude. So the people can no longer hope for liberation, but there's one among them who can still hope for it for them, who can imagine what it's like to be free, who could want that freedom for them and help bring it about for them. And Moses, on his part, can't completely forget this link he has to the Hebrew people. He can't abandon it. He's almost like an adopted child, Father Bartholomew says, obsessed with finding out who his real parents were. So a part of him still acknowledges these origins and recognizes the possibility that he himself could have been among those slaves. And so it's this twofold attachment that allows Moses this unique position to be the liberator. He wants to be with his people, and yet he wants to live in freedom, and so he must take the people and make them free. It was this twofold attachment that turned Moses into a savior, Bartholomew writes. And notice that Moses continues to remember his people even when he's in exile. So after he murders the Egyptian overseer, he flees for his life, and he becomes neither Egyptian nor Hebrew. He becomes a Midianite, a desert nomad in the Sinai Peninsula. He takes on a new people, a new identity, marries, settles down. He becomes one of them. And yet when God appears to him, he doesn't deny this continued relation to the Hebrews and never protests that, oh, that's in the past. I'm no longer affiliated with those people. He still recognizes that he's one of them. And so he has a kind of responsibility to them and to do what the Lord asks. So Moses enters into solidarity with this ancestral people. And it's important to note that he didn't have to. He could have chosen to just become entirely Egyptian. But when he was out and grown up, he saw these people, he saw where they were, and this moved them. This moved him. They were still other to him, notice, that's Bartholomew's point there, but he could at least see them as human because he was like them. So we're not dealing with two different species of human being here. Moses can't say, oh, I'm a fundamentally different type of creature. No, I'm one of them, and yet look at them. They're being treated like objects, like animals. So he perceives this injustice of treating a person like a thing, and he becomes angry and he acts. And so Father Bartholomew writes, to be one with his brother and not to be able to live in the conditions in which he saw them living moved him to try and draw them out of their distress, not by some preconceived plan, but by spontaneous reaction. And so he gets angry and immediately acts, strikes down the overseer, but of course it goes terribly wrong. It's utterly futile. I mean, backfires magnificently. He alienates Pharaoh. He alienates the Hebrews who are afraid of him. What are you going to kill me now? So everything goes wrong with this initial plan because it was initiated by him, and not even by a rational, reflective part of him, by his passions. So Moses had to experience this to understand that anything that originates from him, any effort that is his, is going to fail. God intervened for those who have already had experience of human enthusiasm, that's what Moses felt, and human attempts at intervention, and have seen where such things have led. I love this section on page 65. Only then do they come to realize that they are not great enough, that the problem of man's liberation is not a human problem. This is not a problem that human beings can solve. This is not a form of misery that human efforts can fully correct and heal. True liberation has to come from God alone. This is the point of the next part of the story. And so Father Bartholomew continues, if men on their own intervene in the belief that they can deliver themselves, they either break themselves or make compromises with concessions that change the liberation of their dreams into another form of slavery. This, as he writes in the next chapter, is the point, you might say, the rationale of the law as a whole, to free the people in a way that allows them to live so that they don't return to that same state of exploitation and slavery, either within their boundaries or in relation to other peoples. And the bigger principle is that we can neither liberate nor fulfill ourselves on our own by our own efforts. Only God can do it. So Father Bartholomew summarizes 3 steps that Moses goes through in his maturation. He first has to surrender control to God. So he's not doing it, it has to be God who does it. And then he's open, he listens. He listens to God's voice and goes where God leads him. And then when he acts, he's acting in faith, believing that God will act through him, that it's not only his power really that is at work here, but God is going to be channeling his own power through Moses' efforts. And in this way, Moses allows God to do what only he can do. So the people can't liberate themselves. They're way too beaten down for that. And Moses himself is powerless to liberate them on his own, by his own efforts. God has to do it. And it's even more poignant to notice that it's this broken people, led by a broken mediator, that God uses to bring about liberation and to establish his chosen people for the blessing of the world. God chose to begin in an unknown place, in hearts that did not even know how to suffer anymore, and that seemed beyond all resistance and all human effort to save the world. For what God dreads more than anything is a heart that lets itself be satisfied with something other than him. Beautiful line there. So God chooses what's empty because if it's empty, he can fill it with himself. If it's full of other things, then there could be competition, and perhaps they would turn to those other things. But when he redeems the people of Israel, he redeems them in a way that they turn to him and him alone. So as Father Bartholomew concludes, those who set foot on the other side of the sea are no longer the same. And the whole experience of liberation culminates in this joyful song, this acknowledgement of a state of freedom that no one even dared to imagine. And it comes from this direct dependence on God and God's power alone. Okay, so that's chapter 3 of Father Bartholomew. And now we transition to the end of the wandering in the wilderness. I'm kind of skipping over some stuff here. But at the end of Deuteronomy, we have Moses addressing the people who are about to enter into the promised land. Now, these are the next generation of Israelites. The generation that is liberated from Egypt dies off, in part because of God's judgment. They're not deemed worthy to enter the promised land. And so it's their children who are given the land. But Moses is still around. He's still the mediator. And he gives this final address to the people to summarize the Lord's mighty deeds and favors. So he begins this section with the words, "You've seen with your own eyes all that the Lord did in the land of Egypt." That the Lord is now allowing you to understand. He's giving you eyes to see, your ears to hear this day. So listen up. And then he recounts the whole experience. He said, "I've led you for 40 years in the wilderness, and your clothes are still intact. You've still got your shoes. Look at what the Lord has done for you. He's sustained you with food, with water. He's brought you to this place so that you might know that I, the Lord, am your God." And that's really the point, to know God and to serve him in this new land. And so Moses exhorts the people, "Observe carefully the words of this covenant, therefore, in order that you may succeed in whatever you do." So he's instructing this new generation in the way that he instructed the past generation at Mount Sinai, and they accept the covenant like their fathers and mothers did. And Moses said, "You all are bound by this covenant, and this also includes all the descendants that come after you." So the Jewish people today see themselves at this scene, that they are bound by the covenant at this moment where Moses addresses the people about to enter into the promised land, because every descendant of those Israelites is included in this covenant. Moses warns against idolatry. This is central, as we'll see for next Monday. Do not turn your hearts to other gods. This is key. If you do serve the gods of other nations, the Lord will punish you. His burning wrath will flare up against you. He will blot out your names from under the heavens, and he'll make your land like Sodom and Gomorrah. So don't worry about what's been revealed to you. Stay in your lane. Don't worry about what hasn't been revealed to you. Keep the commandments that have been revealed to you, and all will be well in the land you're about to enter. So don't be too curious. Don't experiment with other gods, the religious rites of other peoples. Stay with me. There's also so statutes set out for the repentant, for those who have wandered, who have become wayward. And it's beautiful. It's an expression of compassion. If you have sinned and return to the Lord with your whole heart, your whole being, the Lord will restore you. And he'll integrate you back into the people and make you even more prosperous than you were before. And you see in this chapter, this phrase, circumcise your hearts. which kind of sounds odd at first, but what it means is that mark your hearts indelibly with a sign of faithfulness, like the indelible mark on the human body that's a sign of the covenant. Mark your hearts in that way so that you won't forget. That's the main point. Don't forget what happened, what the Lord did for you, and what you need to do in order to remain in right relationship to God. So in setting before the people the covenant and the command to obey it, he's setting before the people a fundamental choice of life or death. And it isn't a matter of whether you're loyal or disloyal, obedient or disobedient. What's really at stake here is whether you flourish and find your fulfillment as a people. The Lord wants the people to live, not to die, and to live life in the fullest way possible. And he's giving them a plan or a blueprint for doing that. So follow the law, remain faithful, and you will have life, and you will enjoy this new land of plenty, which I'm about to give you. So then the Lord takes Moses up Mount Nebo and shows him from the top of the mountain the promised land in the distance. But Moses is told that he will not enter it. And this is often a question I have at this point in the Bible, whether this is fair. Moses has been through a lot. He's talked with the Lord face to face. Why would the Lord not allow Moses to finish his work and lead the people into the promised land? I mean, like, even if he just gets over the border, and drops dead, like right when he gets over the border, that would be a lot more closure, right? But why is he just allowed to see it and not to enter it at all? But there is a reason, and it's kind of explained in chapter 31. It is the Lord your God who will cross before you, Moses says. So it's not me, it's not Moses who brought you here. It's the Lord. It's God alone who leads you and brings you into the promised land. And it is the Lord your God who marches with you, and he will never fail you or forsake you. And it's a little bit related to that commandment against idolatry, because if Moses has this glorious procession into the promised land, the people might be tempted to look at Moses as this definitive leader. Maybe they would become the Mosites and like Buddhists, and take this original founder of the faith or way of life as the sort of preeminent leader, and that could impinge upon their ultimate reverence and obedience and loyalty to God. And so to prevent that, it's the Lord himself who leads them in, not Moses. But Moses does give the people some final instructions. He tells them to read through the law regularly on a yearly basis, read through it all. Joshua will be your new leader. So there is appointed a new leader of the Israelites. And Moses concludes his life with this beautiful song. It's an account of the whole Exodus experience, and it's meant to help the people to remember what the Lord's done for them so that they'll remain faithful and obey the law. And you might remember, and it's easier to remember things if they're put in song form. So Moses gives them a song. Then Moses dies and is buried in an undisclosed place. So there's not even a grave where you could build a shrine to go visit Moses. And that's, I think, quite intentional. The story is not about Moses. It's about the Lord and what the Lord's doing for the people. Moses is an instrument. He's a servant. And so even to this day, no one knows where Moses is buried. Well, I just wanted to show you this map very briefly of the route of the Exodus through the Sinai Peninsula. At the bottom of the Sinai Peninsula, you can see Mount Sinai with a question mark, in parentheses, Horeb. It's another name of the Mount of Sinai. There's a monastery there to this day, St. Catherine's Monastery, that was built at the base of this mountain that many people identify as Mount Sinai. So the tradition at least supposes that this mountain exists. It's there to this day. There's a monastery located there. Now, where the people got held up and basically went in circles was in the northeastern part of the Sinai Peninsula. And this is where the generation kind of spends itself out, the generation that is deemed to be unworthy of entering into the promised land. But then eventually they cross the Jordan River. Oh no, they cross the Negev Desert, rather, to the east side of the Dead Sea, and the Jordan River, which runs north of the Dead Sea. I think it flows into the Dead Sea, but it's that's where it flows. That's where it ends. The people crossed the Jordan River into the Promised Land, north of the Dead Sea there, and those places, Gilgal, Jericho. These are the first places where the Israelites encounter the native or indigenous inhabitants of Canaan as they enter into the Promised Land. Okay. So now on to Judges 1 through 5. Just a brief word about this transition here. There's really two biblical accounts of Israel's entry into the Promised Land. There's one that emphasizes invasion and conquest, and that's the book of Joshua. And it's a grand, glorious tale of Israelites' systemic string of victories over the native peoples. And Israelite purifies the land of idolatry and of anything that smacks of the old culture that was there. And so it's more of a triumphalistic account, and many biblical scholars think it's more of a parable or symbolic account of the people's entry into the Promised Land. But then the book of Judges reflects a more progressive settlement and infiltration into the Promised Land. And this could take the form of just a peaceful infiltration where they, as nomadic peoples, herders, eventually grow more and more numerous in the more rural areas. There's another account which has the Israelites banding together with other poor peoples, and this has an etymological explanation. The Hebrew word apiru is the name often given to these peasants that come and revolt against the city people, and some people think apiru is where the word Hebrew comes from. But this seems to have more archaeological evidence on its side that the Israelites progressively entered the Promised Land and grew by fits and starts with various confrontations and setbacks, and came to settle a significant part of this land around the Jordan River, but not quite yet to the coast, as we'll see. So in its new neighborhood here, really just straddling the Jordan River and the Dead Sea, Israel is relatively underdeveloped, less technologically and culturally advanced than its neighbors. So it begins really on the low end of the socioeconomic and civilizational hierarchy. It's landlocked, it's in the backwater, and the peoples around it, like the Philistines or the Phoenicians, are descendants of the Mycenaean people, so they're very adept at trading, at seafaring. They would go all over the Mediterranean. They were much more kind of plugged in, civilized, and in comparison, Israel, it's a community of former slaves. So they're really just trying to get back on their feet. They don't have iron weapons like the Philistines do. They don't have a lot of the literature. I mean, the writing is still kind of getting up and running for the Hebrews at this time. But they do have a very distinctive polity, a very distinctive social model. So it's a group of tribes that's relatively decentralized. It's a federation more than it is a single nation or people or empire. And it's united by the observation of this set of laws, which they believe God gave to their servant or their prophet, Moses. So there's common rituals, customs, laws, and stories that unite these 12 tribes. And they do come together from time to time for important feast days. They usually gather at that tabernacle that Moses commanded they make, which was located in this place called Shiloh, and I can show you that in a second. But most of the time, of course, this tabernacle was portable, but most of the time it was situated at this town called Shiloh, which is beautiful because the word Shiloh means peace in Hebrew, related to shalom. They don't have a king. This is one of the most distinctive elements of this group of tribes. They have no central authority. They only have orders of priests that help facilitate their fulfillment of these common laws. And occasionally they have these prophetic figures called judges and the ancestral tribal leaders, but there's no central authority, no king or ruler over all of them in any way. And so they have no standing army, no conscription, no universal taxation system. They live in relative freedom. but also vulnerable to outside forces. But the Lord alone is their king. So they don't have a king because their king is their God, Yahweh. And the people rely continually upon his power and his provision to protect them, to give them what they need. And so that's the rationalization for the rationale for their new social model. So these are a couple maps that you can look at. The one on the left just shows you in green the area that the Israelites occupied initially in the era of the judges. And notice it's nowhere near the coastline because the Philistines and the Phoenicians occupied that territory. So they were landlocked around a salt sea, the Dead Sea, and then this little creek, which is what the Jordan River amounts to, and the Sea of Galilee, which is a nice source of fresh water. They divided the land up between the tribes. Now on the right, you have kind of the ideal planned allotment of the land. So this is the land that was given to us, and here's how we're going to divide it up. But it was more in theory and less a reality. The map on the left is more of the reality that they lived with. The borders would go back and forth, of course, as they fought with their neighbors. But mainly they stayed around that town of Shiloh. Now, I don't know if I can just point this out with my pointer here, but there's Shiloh on this map, centrally located. And here it is on this map. And these point out where the judges came from. These are sort of the list of judges that ruled in the different periods of their settlement. Both maps have that, and they're fairly spread around, which is interesting. It also gives you a sense of how many judges there were, at least as featured in the book of Judges. So what is a judge? Well, first of all, it's an inheritor of Moses' role as servant, mediator, charismatic authority. And this is God's trusted representative to the people. But they also have a social authority. They were often generals, wise men or sages, magistrates or judges in the ordinary sense, deciding lawsuits and disputes, and an oracle telling the future, receiving messages from God. They weren't all good people, though. And if you read the book of Judges, you'll see that. Some of them were tricksters, rogues, adulterers, idolaters even in some cases. But God chooses all of them in one way or another to help the people. They live up to their calling to different degrees. But the Lord raises up judges at moments of great need. And some prominent examples are Ehud, Deborah, the lone female judge, Gideon, Jephthah, Samson, who was an especially nasty guy, Micah, and Samuel, the last of the judges, who then gives way to the monarchy, as we'll see. So the pattern here, there is this noticeable pattern in the book of Judges, and biblical scholars make a lot of it, and they make graphs like the one you see on the bottom left there. It's often called the cycle of sin. I like to call it the cycle of sin and redemption because it's sin that kind of moves this circle around, but it does lead back to a state of right relationship or redemption. So they start out in a state of obedience and faithfulness. But this often leads to prosperity. Things get too cushy, and this leads to complacence. And eventually idolatry. Now, idolatry is really the key catalyst for the people's downfall. And this sin leads to various forms of affliction, subjugation, conquest, slavery. And amidst this affliction, Israel cries out to the Lord, and God raises up a judge. So God chooses a judge to meet the needs of the people at particularly bad times. And then the judge leads the people out of this affliction and returns them to right relationship with the Lord. So this pattern covers pretty much the whole book of Judges, but you see it several times, even in those first 5 chapters you read. The people fall, they become complacent and sin, and then they experience suffering, which then leads them to cry out to God, who sends a judge, which leads them back to God, to the state of obedience, and starts all over again. But the end of the book of Judges ends with an ominous note. And this is sort of maybe a theme or heading for the whole book. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Now, if you just stop there, you might think, well, that might be a good thing, right? Because the Lord is supposed to be their king. But then the next part of that sentence makes clear that it's not entirely good. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. And so then it makes you think, well, there's no king in Israel at all, whether human or divine. So eventually things devolve to the point where no authority is left, and people just take themselves as their own authority for what they do. And then that leads to the next crisis, which then will lead us into the monarchy and King David. All right, so that's it for today. Thanks for hanging in there with me, and we'll see you in class.